Good morning, everybody. It's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question, and I'm not going to throw it up here because that's going to be its whole other video later today, asking me to kind of make a list, because I'd mentioned this before, of all of the stupid exercises that bodybuilders do, meaning things that are dangerous, that create muscle imbalances, cause inflammation in tendons, joint damage, things like that. That would be a pretty comprehensive list, but I'll try to knock out 5 to 7 of the best ones later. But one of them came to mind when I was sitting down thinking, which ones do I really want to cover in that video? Which are the most important ones? And one came to mind that I realized is its own entire video, and the reasons why it's a problem is its own entire video. And that's where bodybuilders do, like, basically their knees way out in front of them, squats on a Smith machine. Even worse when they put the plates under their heels and do them on the Smith machine. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do some crafting, and let's discuss that. Let's explain why that's really a problem. All right, first of all, cover point 1, because there's several problems with it. First of all, you are putting yourself, when you do that, into an unnatural position. When you squat, if you guys watch people squat, you notice there's multiple joints in play here. There are multiple joints moving. The knees, the hips, even the ankles. So you have dorsiflexion of the ankle. You have the knees bending all the way to at least 90 degrees. You have the hips bending at least to 90 degrees. So you have multiple, a ball and socket joint, a hinge joint that are moving through pretty much a full range of motion. And there tends to be back extension involved also. The back has some lever involved. Very, very few people on any type of squat are able to maintain a perfectly upright position. This is a very complex movement, and it has individual arcs from each joint, because when you think about it, joints don't move in a straight line. Really, they move in arcs and planes, right? There's usually an arc, a curvature involved in the motion of a joint. Even if it's straight in one plane, there's an arc in another. So even on your bench press, if you think about it that way, even if you manage to turn your arms way out to the side and go straight up and down, there's still an arc involved in these other joints. So it's unavoidable, and the problem is that when you lock something into a fixed plane that has multiple major joints involved in the body, and you force it into a straight line, and that's what the Smith machine does. That's what makes it dangerous. You force it into a straight line, you put a lot of those joints under load, under heavy load here. I mean, it's heavy for you usually. We could argue, well, that person's got one plate aside. Well, that's heavy for them. They're straining. They're forcing their joints to work against side loading and shifting when they're trying to go into an arc, because they're forcing them into a straight line. That puts, in some cases, a load on your joints that can harm them. And in fact, it really messes with the curvature of your back a lot. So actually, the thing is, Smith machine squats can be really harsh on your back, and in some cases your knees. Not so much the hips, because that's a ball and socket joint that has a lot of free movement, so it can be forced to do certain things. So it's going to tend to be, the problems are going to be on the knees and potentially your lower back from doing them on a Smith machine, because you forced it into an unnatural plane. Now, a lot of bodybuilders try to get around that by sitting way back and putting their legs out in front of them. And their argument is that they are trying to make it more quad dominant. And that's an interesting point also. We're going to get to that in a second, because quad dominance causes injuries. But they do that, and then that ultimately puts more shearing stress on the knee when they do it that way. They end up having more knee problems as a result of it, even though it keeps their back okay, because it takes that additional movement of the back out. It ends up putting a lot of stress on the knee joint. So then these same people are then going to complain later that their knees hurt, right? Well, they're doing a double whammy on their knees by doing this. Because ultimately what a lot of bodybuilders try to do, or people who are just physique oriented, they really focus on the show muscles more, not the go muscles. Meaning the show muscles tend to be on the front side of the body. You can see them front on in the mirror. The go muscles are most visible from behind. So show muscles are things like front and side delts, right? Your pectorals, your biceps, your quadriceps. Now your abs also, but you know, that's a separate topic. In fact, really strong abs is a fantastic thing to have for injury prevention. You want your abs as strong as possible to protect your back, so that one's a totally separate topic. But all those other show muscles, whereas in the go muscles, are what make you explosive oftentimes in an athletic field, and they prevent injuries the most. They're oftentimes the most important in joint stabilization. And that's things like hamstrings, glutes, lats, rear delts, traps, spinal erectors. Those are the muscles that we call go muscles. That's what gives you power. That's what gives you speed. That's what makes you a bad motherfucker. When you're out on a football field or a rugby field or a wrestling match, someone who has really, really powerful muscles on the posterior chain of their body, you don't want them hitting you at a full run on a field. You don't want them kicking you. You don't want them grabbing you and pulling and twisting, because those are the people who are going to dislocate joints and stuff when they grab a hold of you and twist. Those are bad motherfuckers. Those are your serious power and strength athletes. So, posterior chain there, well, the problem is that they focus on the show muscles, and what they're doing, they're trying to take an exercise, basically the squat, and because they feel like their posterior chain isn't strong enough to give them the quads that they want to develop, they try to remove what they're considering to be the weak link so they can get bigger quads, bigger show muscles. Well, the first problem there is that if you become quad dominant, and this is what they're doing, they're saying, okay, so these muscles, the posterior chain is too weak, so I'm going to focus on these quadriceps. I'm going to make them bigger by taking those out. Well, knee problems come from being quad dominant. Having a weak posterior chain, and particularly weak hamstrings and dominant quadriceps, causes stress on your knees when you're running, jogging, walking, doing other activities. And weak hamstrings when people run on a field or twist or whatever on the field is one of the biggest causes of having actual knee joint injuries as a result of that. So in an emergency situation, a struggle, a pickup basketball game, maybe running and playing some flag football even with your bros. Having weak hamstrings because you're too quad dominant. Weak is a relative term. Keep that in mind. Someone could have 3 times stronger hamstrings than the average person, but if they have 6 times stronger quads, they have weak hamstrings as far as that stress is concerned on the knee joint. Strong hamstrings stabilize the knee joint. So they're taking that out to try to make the quad stronger, when the reality is, if they had just spent more time on their posterior chain, they had done a lot more deadlifts. They had done a lot more glute ham raises, basically the things that strength and conditioning coach would have an athlete do to prepare him for being on a field to stabilize his knee joint. If they had just done all that stuff, they would be stronger on the squat, because their weak link that these guys have would no longer be a weak link, and then they would be able to utilize enough workload that their quadriceps would get as big as they could possibly get. And I'm not saying some quad isolation and quad dominant work doesn't have its place in some routines. What I'm saying is these guys are doing it because their posterior chain is too weak. Their go muscles are too weak, so they're using an exercise that's quad dominant to compensate, to build them up. Because again, their performance is lacking because their glutes and hamstrings are too weak to squat a significant enough weight or workload even with higher reps. Well, the solution is not to do a quad dominant exercise, it's to build those muscles up. And then if you've done that correctly, you will find that your quadriceps will get massively big. Now, is it necessarily going to be big enough to win Mr. Olympia? Probably not, but most of you guys don't have the genetics or the drug stack to win that either. So why are you worrying about it? And that's the problem we run into, is that ultimately they're creating a muscle imbalance because they already had a muscle imbalance. They were already weak in the posterior chain, so they're just going to train it even less instead of realizing, if I build that posterior chain up, my quads will come up automatically because all of my lower body compounds, I'm going to be using more workload. I'll force the quads to get stronger because I'm strong enough all around to use a bigger workload. Therefore, it's going to put more stress on those quads. They're going to get more metabolic fatigue. They're going to get more mechanical tension, and it's going to force them to grow. So instead, they focus on just the show muscle while further neglecting the go muscle, and then they scream and complain and cry that their knees hurt. How many of these guys who do stuff like this do you see talking about that their knees hurt, their knees hurt? Well, their knees hurt because they have a massive muscle imbalance that they're continuing to make worse by not addressing it and trying to remove the weak muscle, which should be the strong muscle. Keep that in mind. You have a muscle imbalance if your hamstrings and your glutes are limiting what you can squat. If they're your limiting factor, you have an enormous muscle imbalance, because those are the muscles that really are supposed to be powerful in that exercise. So if your quads aren't getting enough stimulation from the squat, it's because the posterior chain is too weak. And it also means that you are setting yourself up for injury by continuing to be quad dominant. So again, these Smith machine squats are dangerous on multiple levels. They not only are setting the person up for actual injuries during the training itself by forcing everything into an unnatural plane of motion and putting stress on the joints that don't need to be there because they're not allowing them to move through their normal range of motion and arc and planes of motion under load, but also because they have a tendency to be used to further worsen an existing muscle imbalance that is a known and understood cause of knee injuries in the sports and athletic world. So Smith machine squats are a dangerous and stupid exercise. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.